Greetings, and thank you for joining us for this edition of Peter's Field Hospital, the official podcast for the website Where Peter Is. I'm Mike Lewis, the managing editor of wherepeteris.com, and with me today is Dan Amiri. This is the first part of our conversation with Rodrigo Guerra. Rodrigo has a PhD from the International Academy of Philosophy in the Principality of Liechtenstein. He is an ordinary member of the Pontifical Academy for Life, a member of the Theological Commission of the Latin American Council of Bishops, and is the founder of the Center for Advanced Social Research. He is married with 3 children and lives in Mexico. Before we begin the program, I would like to thank our Patreon sponsors, especially Lisa, Chris, and Steven. If you would like to support our work on Patreon, please click on the Patreon button on the right-hand column of wherepeteris.com. Thank you for your generosity. We can't do it without you. Welcome, Rodrigo, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the patience of the audience that is going to hear peculiar opinions of a Mexican. Thank you very much.
Well, we're thrilled to have you. Before we begin, why don't you give us a little bit of your faith background and your biography and how you became involved in working for the church?
Well, this is a long story, but in a rich version of the story is I was born in an ordinary Mexican family, but with a peculiarity. My father was agnostic, and my mother was a believer, but she was, at that time when I was born, she was not very close to the church. But little by little, by a lot of events, by a lot of happenings that were happening in our lives, we discovered Jesus and the church. My oldest brothers and sisters are not close to the church, but my parents and myself, we began to discover what Jesus, who he is, and providential opportunity that we were receiving by faith. And when I finished my high school, I began to study philosophy in a small university called Popular Autonomous University of the State of Puebla. And I received a very good education there, but mainly based in Gilson and Fabro. It was a faculty of philosophy following Thomas Aquinas, mainly following the understanding developed by Cornelio Fabro, who was an important Italian Thomistic philosopher, and Etienne Gilson, who is more or less behind many schools of Thomistic philosophy all over the world. And after this, I studied with the Jesuits in the Iberoamericana University. I studied a little bit of Lonergan in that time. And then suddenly, through a common friend, I discovered the existence of the International Academy of Philosophy. For me, it was an enormous gift to discover this place, because I wanted to write my dissertation on Karol Wojtyła. I applied to the Catholic University of Lublin, but the professors in Lublin recommend me to study in Liechtenstein because the best PhD students from Poland were traveling to Liechtenstein to receive the lectures there. So I went to Liechtenstein, and I discovered mainly my main professor, the one who not only educated me in the field of philosophy, but also in spirituality, in politics, and in many other things, whose name is Rocco Buttiglione. And Rocco Buttiglione and myself, we have been working together for several years in different academic projects. So in 1994, I think, I became a professor and then academic director of the John Paul II Institute in Mexico City, the John Paul II Pontifical Institute. A little bit late, I was invited by the Conference of Bishops to be in charge of the so-called Social Affairs Ministry of the Conference of Bishops, in order to organize the social ministry all over the country and the so-called Caritas. We created an enormous federation of Caritas all over the country. And then I was invited by the Latin American Conference of Bishops to participate as an advisor in Catholic social doctrine. In the year 2004, the president of the Latin American Conference invited me to create a new department called the Social Observatory. And the first project we received in our hands was to prepare the fifth General Conference of Latin American Bishops in Aparecida. So from 2004 to 2007, we prepared creating a lot of teams for creating an analytic understanding of what's happening in Latin America and also in the States, by the way, in order to help the bishops to see a common diagnosis about what was happening. I finished my work as director of the Social Observatory in 2008, 1 year after Aparecida. And then with the infrastructure we created in Mexico, we created a novelty in the Mexican society, the so-called Center for Advanced Social Research. All the institutes of scientific research in Mexico, I would say the 90% of the scientific institutes are public, are sponsored by the government and controlled ideologically by government. Our institute is the only one devoted to social sciences and liberal arts. And it's the only one which is Catholic based. So in Mexico, in Mexico, we do not have a tradition of Catholic scientific institutions. So we have been working, now we have 20 full-time professors in our institute. We offer MAs in different fields, and we give advice to our Conference of Bishops, to the Latin American Conference, and to the Holy See in different dicasteries. This is more or less a little bit what we do.
And thank you for that. And we'll get to talk about Pope Francis and some of the things that he's published and promulgated over the course of his papacy. But as I understand, you really can't understand Pope Francis without first understanding the environment and the culture in which he was raised and also in which he operated for so many years in Argentina. I was hoping, with your work that you were doing in Latin America, that you could kind of give us some perspective. What are some of the challenges that Latin America faces, and what are some of the triumphs or the successes, if you will? What do we celebrate about Latin American culture that might differ from other areas? What's essential to understanding CELAM and Bergoglio and everything that we'll talk about for the rest of the conversation?
Well, there are several questions, but I will try to answer by just one answer. I would say that one thing that helps a lot to understand what kind of man is Bergoglio, and also and what kind of church Latin American church is to see that the presence of the bishops in Vatican II, the Catholic Latin American bishops in Vatican II, was very silent. There was a joke in that time among the conciliar fathers saying that the true silence church, the true church of silence, was not the Eastern church, was the Latin American church, because the Latin American bishops were there, but without opening their mouths. So when you read, let's say, the diaries, the acts of the Vatican II, you will discover just a few little speeches from the Latin American bishops. The Latin American bishops were truly quiet. But I would say that maybe they were also praying, trying to understand, trying to discover what was at the bottom of this renewal in the church. And I would say this is not a mere pious expression, because in 1968, just a few years after Vatican II, the bishops organized the so-called Second Latin American Conference of Bishops in Medellin, Colombia. And there, they tried to put all the wealth of the Vatican II in the field of Latin America in order to respond to the pastoral challenges of the church of the time. I would say that the trick, the novelty that they introduce is the first, let's say, group of bishops in all the world who were very involved to download all the wealth of the Vatican II in a particular challenge were the Latin American bishops. So it was one of the very first experiences of applying Vatican II. Second, the way of applying the Vatican II was not based in a mere deductive approach. Deduction means to have some universal insights and to try to discover new truths going down to the empirical realm, to the concrete realm. The Latin American bishops didn't put in practice such a scheme. They discovered that the Vatican II was teaching precisely the opposite. The church, the true church, is the people of God walking in history. So is the people of God in movement, in motion. So with this approach, they first of all heard the voice of the church, the voice of the people of God, trusting in the Holy Spirit that expresses somehow through the people of God. And hearing the people of God, they try to organize all this practical wisdom, illuminating this wisdom with the Vatican II and offering a new document, the so-called Medellin document. So in order to understand Bergoglio and the Latin American Church, we need to understand these. What has been the experience of the Latin American Church in the last 50 years is the experience of a theoretical awareness of a practical movement. It's not mere to develop theology like in Europe, where you can find many very fine scholars devoting many, many hours in a university writing their enormous books in a wonderful library. No, in Latin America, the first moment is to live faith with people and discovering in the flesh of the other the true presence of Jesus Christ, to reflect what God is asking you. And after this, offering this reflection to the discernment of the bishops in order to have a new teaching, in order to guide the church. So this was the way for applying Vatican II in Latin America. Bergoglio was educated in this approach, This approach is not new. It's based, for instance, in Paul VI. In Octogesima Adveniens, number 4, Paul VI explains this method. You have, in order to live truly the experience of faith, you have to live in a small community. Faith is not a mere individual experience, it's a communitarian experience. You find the true God through the flesh of the other. In pertaining to the flesh of the other is an essential dimension of faith. Second, you have to see your surroundings, and you have to put your way of understanding what is happening in your field, and to ask the others to help you to understand this reality with the light of the Word of God. And so this method is explained in Octogesima Adveniens number 4, and somehow this was put in practice, put at the core of the Second General Conference of Bishops in Medellin. Paul VI was very influential, but also because he gave a super important speech to the farmers and indigenous people in Medellin before the opening of the General Conference. And in that speech, which is very long, the main idea, the main topic is the poor are true sacrament of Christ. Not a metaphorical sacrament, not an analogous sacrament, but a true sacrament of Christ. Because the universal sacrament is the church, and the poor are a peculiar moment for discovering, unveiling the true face of Jesus Christ, who is suffering and resurrecting in this very moment among us. So with this approach, Paul VI gave to the Latin American bishops a clue for being brave, for being prophetical. And Bergoglio somehow inherited all this approach. He was educated as a Latin American Jesuit in Argentina. He was very close to the theology of people, a peculiar non-Marxist version of the Latin American liberation theology. And one day he became Pope, and now he's trying to help the Universal Church through his own experience as Latin American and also as a Latin American Jesuit.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder if you could go into explaining a little bit more, because there are some stereotypes that English-speaking Catholics have about the Latin American Church. You talk about this theology of the people as opposed to a Marxist version of liberation theology. I think what a lot of Americans, especially the conservative Catholic media, they look at the Latin American church as, prior to Vatican II having been robust, universally accepted, something that the Latin American people had really been faithful to. And then the narrative is that liberation theology came in, deconstructed the Latin American church, and now you have threats from secularism, a lot of Pentecostals. Perhaps you could go into a little bit of detail about the sociological history of the Latin American church over the last 50 or 60 years.
Well, first, I understand your question and your concerns, and I know that in the States and in some other parts of the world, there is an enormous stereotype about theology of liberation. And we need to clarify this. And maybe a first element in order to clarify this is, yes, first to discover that the Latin American scenario in the last 50 years has been very difficult because many projects for restructuring our economies have failed. Most of those projects were sponsored by different international organizations trying to help economically Latin America, and were also promoted by the United States. So this failure for us as Latin Americans has been very, very meaningful, because in many occasions we admire very much the levels of development and wealth that many people enjoy in the United States. But when the American advisors from the International Monetary Fund or the American government organize the so-called restructuration programs in Latin America, they failed. They failed. And in many occasions, these I would say this helped to discover, at least in the field of the Latin American church, that we need to discover our own path for development. It's not always the best idea to follow the best practices performed, for instance, in the States. The best idea is always to discover your own path, because the American experience grew based in the roots of American people. And I will not tell you anything about this because you know better than me the history of the United States. I would say this is what we have to learn. We need to rediscover our origins. We need to rediscover our identity in order to discover our own path. And this process somehow was awakened, put on the table precisely in 1968 when the Second Latin American Conference was organized. And so one of the most striking elements of this conference in Medellin was to recognize that the poor in Latin America were millions. Second, that the poor have to be understood in the light of the fathers of the church. So the second conference of Latin American bishops is closer to the fathers of the church than to a mere scholastic or neo-scholastic approach. It's very clear when you read the document of Medellin, you discover expressions that you can find, for instance, in St. Augustine or in some others, than in a systematic manual published in Rome in the 50s. This is the true root of what was happening in Latin American church. One way to understand what was happening is to see that the bishops in Latin America rediscovered the fathers of the church, not Karl Marx, but the fathers of the church. In 1968 or 9, Gustavo Gutierrez, a Peruvian priest, in that time he was diocesan, now he's Dominican. Gustavo Gutierrez tried to receive all this wealth, all this reflection, and try to explain using the sociological tools that he had in that moment. And the tools were not Marxist, were tools based in the so-called theory of development. The theory of development was a sociological and an economical approach to understand the relation between the dependent and independent economies in that time. So for many conservative persons in that time, when they hear dependence, independence, structures of based that legitimate dependency. They thought this was Marxism, but it was not Marxism. It was theory of development. And in some moments, some other theologians of liberation use Marxist elements. So when Cardinal Ratzinger wrote Libertatis Nuncius, the first instruction on theology of liberation, he focused on one of the main trends in that time about theology of liberation, who was using a lot of Marxist elements in order to discover the meaning of the Holy Scripture and in order to discover the meaning of reality, of social reality in Latin America. This trend was founded by Hugo Assmann, not by Gustavo Gutiérrez. Hugo Assmann, Giulio Girardi, some persons who tried to mix Marxism with the gospel. Gustavo Gutiérrez was not linked with this trend. He was more linked with theology, with theory of development, and with the fathers of the church, and with Jacques Maritain, by the way. When you read Theology of Liberation, you can feel a little bit the Maritainian approach in many aspects. So at least we have to discover that there are these two trends. There is another trend, very problematic in theology of liberation, the guerrilla trend, let's say. There were priests who were not very academic, were not very skilled in intellectual discussions, but were involved in the guerrilla, like Camilo Torres, like M19, a guerrilla group, the Golconda group. All these groups were not theoretical, were not pastoral, were military, paramilitary. And so this trend was also very problematic. This trend was not touched by the first instruction, but indirectly, but it was the most problematic. The trend that was touched by the first instruction on theology of liberation was Hugo Assmann's, let's say, understanding of this. But the theology of liberation developed by Gustavo Gutiérrez, by Segundo Galilea, who developed more in his books in the field of spirituality, and by some others, Libanio, for instance, and some others, was more a critical reflection, but being always attentive to the challenge of communio. That's why Gustavo Gutiérrez was never, ever condemned by the Vatican. Leonardo Boff was condemned by the Vatican many years later, but Gustavo Gutiérrez was not. And I would say the main fruit of all these different trends was the understanding developed by the Latin American bishops. One of the most important trends of the theology of liberation somehow is the official teaching of the church in Latin America. The documents raised in the second, the third, the fourth, and the fifth General Latin American Conference. Theology of liberation, without a Marxist approach, but recognizing the suffering of our people who needs to discover freedom through liberation. So freedom is somehow the target, and liberation is the process for discovering a new atmosphere for living faith and for living our human rights. In the middle of the teachings of the bishops, the novelty of the first trends in the theology of liberation, a group of theologians in Argentina developed precisely the so-called theology of people. Theology of people, if you read the basic books written by Lucio Gera, by Rafael Tello, by Juan Carlos Escanone, or by Jorge Bergoglio, you will discover they were just, I don't want to minimize the importance of them, but they were commenting Vatican II mainly, with some shades. For instance, what is people? What is nation? What is culture? If you see these categories, it's very similar to what Wojtyła made in Poland in the same time. He was reflecting about what is people, what is nation, what is culture, discovering that as far as a person has a vocation, also nations have a vocation. You need to discover the origins of a nation in order to discover its own destiny. So this way of understanding people, culture, nation, vocation was applied, for instance, by John Paul II in his very first visit to the States, saying that the vocation of the United States is to promote freedom and many other things. And these speeches were also given by Pope John Paul II in Poland, in France, in Spain, and in many other countries. I would say the theology of people were doing the same exercise. And yes, they are sympathetic to the struggles defending the rights of the poor. But they were very, very critical to Marxism because the lacks of Marxism in the field of anthropology and in the field of openness to revelation.
I think that's an interesting connection to think of the theology of the people and the work that John Paul II was doing as related, because I think that sort of breaks down any sort of prejudice we might have against what's going on in Latin America or what's the fruit of Pope Francis's work. This isn't a work that is somehow opposed to the church or inherently Marxist. This is a church that you said earlier in the conversation is rooted in that incarnation, the sacrament of the other. I think that's a really rich approach. And honestly, I think in the United States and America and maybe even Western European culture in general, there still seems to be a hesitancy to kind of re-examine or explore the Vatican II theology, the theology of the people, the sacrament of the other, and think about it in new ways that challenge us to go forward. So I think there's a lot of lessons that we need to learn from the Latin American church to think about how we can apply that going forward. I mean, it's definitely a challenge. And
the speech given by Pope Francis to the Congress, the American Congress, somehow put some elements for answering your concern. For instance, I was very surprised that he mentioned Dorothy Day like a good example of living Catholic faith in solidarity, in true solidarity, not in a mere intellectual solidarity, in an empirical solidarity with the poor, in the context of the United States, which is different from the context of Latin America or from the Polish context. But I would say the figure of Dorothy Day, maybe it's important in order to understand Pope Francis, because it's a good American experience that Catholic faith should avoid a bourgeois style. The true faith in Jesus Christ always involves to be faithful to the flesh of the other, to the presence, to the bodily presence of the other, because in this bodily presence, you can recognize the true presence of Jesus Christ, as John Paul II says textually in Ecclesia in America. The true presence of Jesus Christ is in the sacrament of the Eucharist, is in the Word of God, and in everyone, mainly in the poor, where Jesus Christ is really present.
I don't want to drag you into our American culture wars, but there still seems to be a hesitancy regarding Vatican II and its legitimacy. And it seems to me, Mike, I don't know if you would agree, but it seems to me that recently there seems to be maybe we need to think about Vatican II, and maybe not everything was great about Vatican II, and maybe some of those documents are really just pastoral and we don't really need to pay attention to them. But it seems like Latin America has really, the experience of Latin American churches it seems to me that they've really dived into the heart of Vatican II and tried to really explore where it really makes connections with the lives of people. And is there still a challenge in your experience today where maybe there's a hesitancy, or is that a uniquely American thing?
I cannot say a word about the United States because I have been there several times visiting Disneyland or New York. So maybe it's not the best way to discover.
It seems to be that there's still like this hesitancy to really embrace the teachings. I don't know why that experience is so fundamentally different from Latin America, which really seems to be.
Let me try to respond to answer this question in an indirect way. For me, it was very, very, very interesting to see the figure of Monsignor Vigano. Vigano was nuncio in the States. Nobody knows where he exactly lives right now, because he thinks the Pope has certain kind of James Bonds or spies looking for him, and he thinks his life is in risk. But Viganò, in his last writings, has said openly that the problem is the Vatican II. So he gave us a big gift, an enormous gift, in order to have the adequate focus. In certain moments, we distract with Amoris Laetitia. In certain moments, we are distracted by the Amazonian Synod. In some other moments, we are distracted with small discussions about particular topics. But Viganò helps us to put the finger on the main topic. The main topic is the Vatican. Vatican II, yes, is a pastoral council, but as far as pastoral work in the church and pastoral reflection in the church is never separated with doctrine. The so-called pastoral council, the Vatican II as a pastoral council, is also involves a lot of doctrinal issues that have been clarified by Vatican II. And again, Monsignor Viganò gave us the enormous gift to put the finger in the core, somehow in a more clear way than some other, let's say, conservatives or hyper-traditionalists, saying that the most problematic point of Vatican II is Dignitatis Humanae, the document about religious freedom. I would say we have to be thankful with Viganò, at least at this point. His understanding about all these issues, it's very, very problematic. I would say he's not a traditional thinker. He shows his ignorance more than his traditionalism. Why? I'm not saying this only because I want to avoid or to reject Viganò's theories. No, it's because an historical point. The church during the first 4 centuries, even with Constantine, was respectful about freedom in order to believe in the true God. So religious freedom was an essential, a constitutive dimension of the faith of the very first Christians. And one thing that I'm not going to explain in this moment, but it's very interesting, is that even Constantine protected religious freedom in his time, and was Theodosius, the next one, who was, let's say, Constantinian. Theodosius was the one who began to fall in the temptation of thinking, if Jesus Christ is the true God, we have to officialize this belief without the help of freedom. We have to somehow to impose our faith. The guilty was not in Constantine, it was in Theodosius, 379, the year 379. Theodosius began to rule. So Vatican II, in many ways, in many aspects, in many topics, returned to the basics. Sicut servus ad fontes, like a lamb or like a small animal going to the flood in order to drink pure water. So the Vatican II purified liturgy and many other aspects in the life of the church, following the experience of the early Christians. And somehow Viganò tries to recover not this element, but the problematic element that appeared in the 4th century, in the last years of the 4th century with Theodosius. And this problematic element is precisely if freedom is an essential element for believing or not. So I would say, returning to the first point, somehow the experience with the discussions around Viganò will help to understand how to rediscover the Vatican II in the States and in many other places in the world. Vatican II is an enormous treasure, because it's not important by itself. It's like a sign. When you point with your finger to somewhere, you need to see to the pointer, to the target, not to keep your sight in the finger, but for following the direction. And the Vatican II is pointing towards Jesus Christ and the early Christians. The simplicity of the early Christians. Maybe if you want, the naiveness of the early Christians. But I would prefer much more the naiveness of the early Christians than the erudition of a peculiar neo-scholastic approach to faith that involves a very wrong reading about modernity and a very wrong reading about medieval times. Medieval times are the golden age, and modernity is a process of decadence towards atheism and secularism and relativism. Come on, this is not the reading of history that you can discover in St. Augustine, not even in Ratzinger, who is a very big teacher in the field of theology and philosophy of history. I would say when we clarify our sight and we discover the life of the true early Christians, we fall in love with Vatican II, and we understand how to rediscover, not only to rediscover theoretical things, how to restart my own life, following Jesus Christ as a person, as a living person, not as a mere concept.
It's funny that you mentioned religious freedom in the early church, because a few months ago, we published a piece at Where Peter Is by Henry Carlson on that very topic.
Oh, really?
And he referred back to all these early church sources praising and calling for religious liberty. And it's interesting what's strange about the traditionalists today is they believe that there's some form of maybe stare decisis. I don't know if you have that concept in Mexico, but it's a judicial principle that the judge will follow the precedent. And they apply 18th century, 16th century magisterial statements, and they judge current or more recent magisterial statements against what immediately preceded it. I just want to change a little bit of subject, because this is something that's always, whenever I talk to a Latin American Catholic about Pope Francis, I'm always curious to see, because being an American, I grew up with John Paul II as Pope, and then Pope Benedict, and now Francis. And I don't know what it is like to experience having someone from your part of the world whose native tongue is your native tongue, and in your case, someone who you actually knew and were fond of. We can get back a little bit to Aparecida and things that preceded Pope Francis's papacy, but I'm curious what you thought leading into the conclave, what you felt when you saw him walk out onto the loggia, and what that meant to you at the time about the direction of where the church might be going.
Yeah, well, I have to tell you a little personal story. I met Bergoglio before he became Pope in a very funny way. In the year 2005, I published a little book called Catholics and Politics. And it was published by CELAM. And like 1 year later, maybe it was in 2006, I went to Buenos Aires. I visited one of these marvelous libraries they have in Buenos Aires. And suddenly I discovered a book. I opened it and I began to read it, and I said, oh, this is good. Very good. Oh my God, it's my book. It was my book with a different cover, with my name and everything, but it was another edition, published in an unknown publishing house. For me, Agape. It's called Agape. And so I checked. Someone stole my book. Someone published my book without my permission. And I discovered that the book had a foreword written by the Archbishop of Buenos Aires. So I went immediately to talk with the president of CELAM, and I told him, someone stole my book. The late American Conference of Bishops, we need to denounce this, because someone, and the president of the bishops told me, no, all the bishops have the right to publish everything we publish at CELAM. So as far as your book is in CELAM, the Archbishop of Buenos Aires had the right. Well, but at least please give me some information. No, nobody knows about this, and Bergoglio is never going to respect any good advice about sending news or notices or a notification about the publication of the book. So when I met him in Aparecida, I told him, "Oh, come on, you published my book without my permission." So it was very funny. Many years later, when he became Pope, when I saw the moment when he was appointed as a Pope, for me was shocking, absolutely shocking, because in that time I had a lot of interviews, for instance, with CNN, and a very long interview with CNN, and I was saying all my different scenarios. If this group predominates over this other, the candidates are Scola, Ouellet, and this. But I never mentioned Latin American. I never mentioned Bergoglio. When I heard Cardinal and Bergoglio, oh my God! I immediately thought, maybe there is another Bergoglio in Italy or somewhere. No. Bergoglio was Bergoglio. And suddenly I became so happy, so joyful, because I felt immediately, one of us is in the See of Peter. One of us, one of our people, one who has looked the same streets I have been watching for years, one who has smelled, who has saw with his own eyes the many faces of the poor in Latin America. One of us, one who sings with ourselves, one who prays with our liturgy of the hours in Spanish. So for me, it was a moment of joy, enormous joy. And some months later, I met him in the Vatican, and I told him, "Do you remember of that book?" And I told him, "You have to pay me a little bit because you were earning some money with my book." And the Pope answered me, "No, it's on the contrary. It's on the contrary, because now your book is a bestseller because it has the foreword written by a Pope. So now you have to pay me some royalties." So Bergoglio is like this. He's always joking. He's always hopeful. He's young. When you meet him, you discover someone young. This experience, someone who looks to your eyes as if you were the only one person in the world, and someone with a youthful spirit. So for me, Pope Francis, yes, it's a miracle, an enormous gift for me as a Mexican, and I would say it's an enormous gift for the Universal Church.
If you would, give us a little background into your work leading up to Aparecida. I think that conference, that meeting, is still underestimated by people in the United States. And I think there's a lot of insights we can glean into Pope Francis's own approach to things. But give us a little perspective on your work that you did leading up to the meeting, and then how would you describe the general trajectory of that meeting? What should we glean and take away as it applies to Pope Francis?
Yeah, I would say Aparecida is an enormous happening. It's not a document based in a particular concrete scenario of 2007. It's like Vatican II. The kind of reflection Aparecida gives us is a reflection for many years. It's a long view about the church, not only in 2007, but maybe in the next 30 years. So I would say Aparecida has this peculiar epistemological status. It means it has this peculiar approach. It's not talking about the news in the newspaper. It's talking about the mega trends that we are living in the region. So I would mention maybe Pope Francis' understanding of Aparecida. He says, Evangelii Gaudium is a bad version of Aparecida. Aparecida is the good one. Evangelii Gaudium was a good effort in order to help the rest of the church to understand Aparecida. He says these kind of expressions. So what is the core of Aparecida? The core of Aparecida is put in the number 11 and 12 of the document. I suggest you very much to read the number 11 and 12. If you grasp the core of these two numbers, you will understand the whole document, or at least you will have the very essence of the document. What says the number 11 and the number 12 of Aparecida? It says that we need to stop with moralism. Conservative or progressive moralism is a reduction of the essence of faith into ethics. We have to stop with this because the Christian happening is a person, not a value. The kerygma, so the very first announcement, the very first announcement of the gospel is not natural law. Is Jesus Christ risen. So this is very important. It's very simple, but it's very important. We are not witnesses of a value, of a concept. We are witnesses of a resurrected person. Wow! So this is the core of the 11 and 12. And then there are some consequences. We have to avoid to complain all the time about the lacks of the church and the crisis. And no. We have to rediscover the joy of being Christian, the joy of being missionaries, the missionary disciples, the joy of touching Christ, not in a mere metaphorical way, but in a true empirical way in the flesh of the other. We have to rediscover the importance of community in order to rediscover what church really is. Because if we do not belong to a community, we do not understand what church is, even though I have studied a lot of theology. I would say Aparecida somehow put the finger on the topic of discipleship, on mission, but based in a communio. I always think that, for instance, David Schindler and all these guys in the JP2 in Washington sponsor the so-called Communio magazine. And there are some Communio groups for studying the Communio magazine in different parts of the world. But in many occasions, these are mere intellectual approach, mere conceptual approach to different shades and analytic understanding of theology, but not to belong to the flesh of the other. This is very different. To belong is to be to be friend is to take care of the destiny of the other. This is to be a friend. Friendship is to take care of the destiny of the other in an empirical way. When the other needs money, I'm going to be the first to give money to my friend who is needed. Not in a metaphorical sense, but in an empirical sense. Here, there are $1,000 for you because you are needed, because you don't have a job, because you don't have food. So when you discover living church through these experiences, you discover church in a very different way than in a mere conceptual approach. So I would say this is what Aparecida helps us to see. There are many topics in Aparecida, but I would say missionary discipleship lived from the ground of a communio, of a concrete community, is the most important thing.
This concludes part 1 of our conversation with Rodrigo Guerra. Please join us in the upcoming days for part 2, when we discuss Pope Francis, his intellectual life, and his impact on the Church. Until next time, God bless and take care.